What's up, Aurora? Happy day 4,579 of quarantine and happy episode 752 of Quarantine Coffee and Jesus. If you've been following along, then you know that for the last 3 weeks we've been looking at a different spiritual discipline every day. And today I'm wrapping up this series by talking about submission. So let's call out the obvious. Everyone take a breath. If you're anything like me, when you hear the word submission, a lot of things come to mind. So maybe for you, when you hear the word submission, you immediately think of like surrender or giving up or giving into something. Maybe you think of like MMA or Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu because like they have that move or whatever that they put their competitor into submission. Cole, side note, Cole thinks he's a master at BJJ because he went like 2 times. But I'm pretty sure a little girl kicked his butt in class both times. So take that for what you will. Or maybe you think of that very famous, overused and highly abused Bible verse in Ephesians that talks about women or wives submitting to their husbands. Whatever it is that comes to your mind, my hope is that in these next few minutes, we truly come to understand that submission is not something that's intended to like steal the fun out of your life, to suck the joy out of life. And it's not this oppressive command, but it's actually like the most freeing, safe, life-giving position that Jesus invites us into. So we see submission talked about frequently in the Bible. Submission is talked about a lot as it pertains to our horizontal relationships or our relationships with one another, as well as our vertical relationship with Jesus. And while we often hear teachings on submission within the context of marriage, the Bible also addresses submission in almost every other relationship. So marriage, parent-child relationships, like employer-employee, and here it's master and slave, but we would relate it to employer-employee, governments and authorities, and our relationships just with one another as brothers and sisters in Christ. Shout out Juliana. And I think the reason we get like a little bad taste in our mouths when a lot of us hear that word submission is because it's so countercultural, right? Like submitting to someone or something goes against everything that we see, everything that we hear and read, and everything that we're taught in our culture today. Our culture is all about like fighting for your rights and storming the gates to get your own way, and the whole like my truth versus your truth, it's all relative approach. Gender roles and toxic masculinity are really hot topics in churches and schools and in our own homes. And authority has been seen as like oppressive, right? Which is not to say that power has not been often abused and taken advantage of, but it has left our culture constantly like bucking against the system. So I want us to look at a couple like different areas, but I want to look at what Paul had in mind in Ephesians chapter 5 verse 21 when he says, "Now submit to one another out of reverence for Christ." And this verse comes after like 20 previous verses, basically telling us it's like this how to live the Christian life now that you have the Holy Spirit living in you. So Paul's kind of going through this list. He warns against drunkenness, foul language, and hateful or perverse speech, and other admonishments on how we should live or shouldn't live. And so then he moves from talking about our internal behavior, right? Like our individual behavior, and looks at how we should show up in our relationships. And to be clear, like Paul does not, as we look at this verse on submitting to one another, Paul is not shying away from or reversing the fact that there are God-given roles of authority and leadership. In Colossians chapter 3, he established husbands as the leader of your homes, parents as the authority over your children, and governments as the authority and leadership over nations and states and cities. which if we just left it at that, depending on which side of that coin that you're on, is either really great news or really crappy news. If all it said was just, wives, submit to your husbands, children, obey your parents, and citizens, submit to authority and governments, period. For a lot of us, that could be a dangerous, miserable, hopeless place to be, right? If you are a child in a very abusive, toxic home environment and your parents are abusing you or mistreating you, if all you read in this Bible was children, submit to your parents, like, period, that'd be really tough, right? Same with wives living in an abusive marriage, or a marriage where you feel like your husband is asking you to do things that you know are in direct opposition to Jesus. Like, that's problematic. And same with citizens and governments, which, like, regardless of what side you're on or where you land with this, like, there may be times where we've all felt like the government in cities, the government in place over us, maybe dropping the ball. And so it's hard to, like, live in those scenarios and just feel like we're being told to submit. But Jesus doesn't leave it there, and Paul doesn't leave it there. In the very next verse, Paul commands us to submit to one another within those roles, right? So Paul flips the script. Just when people are starting to, like, let this power go to their heads, he flips the script on them. In Colossians, he said, wives, submit to your husbands, but husbands, love your wife as Christ loved the church, laying down his own life for her, to present her holy and blameless to the Lord, right? So there's a challenge and a call for both husbands and wives in this. It's a mutual command to both of them, because if it only goes one way, then that's when we run into abuse of power and position and the feeling of oppression and being less than. And then children, obey your parents, but fathers, do not aggravate your children or they will become discouraged, is what Paul says. So the challenge is for both children and parents, because this is how Christ's love is demonstrated through us, right? This is how Christ has loved us as our Father. He's the perfect Father, and he doesn't just abuse power and put rules in place, and he doesn't just say, because I said so, like, do what I said. But he leads with grace, right? He has grace for us every time that we mess up, every time we break a rule, and everything that he's put in place, all of his rules and discipline and all of that is because he loves us and wants to protect us. So he has already demonstrated the kind of mutual submission. There's still authority and there's still leadership for parents, and children are called to submit under that. But there's this mutual submission of, yes, submit, but parents, fathers, husbands, governments, like, be worthy of that submission. Be the kind of leaders that people want to submit to, and don't abuse that power and use it against God's children. So the goal of mutual submission is to lay down your agenda, your selfish desires, and your pride for the sake of your families, your communities, your marriages. Submission does not mean agreeing on everything, which, like, thank goodness, because otherwise I'd be in a constant state of rebellion. This is important in the context of our relationships with our spouses and our parents, right? Because while we are called to submit to our parents as children, and wives were called to submit to our husbands, that does not mean that we are necessarily going to agree with everything, especially if the things that we're being asked to do are contradicting God's truth, right? If your husband tells you from now on, in this house we're going to worship Satan, like, no, right? Like, absolutely not. You can still love your husband and show respect for him, but you use your wisdom and your discernment and the brain that God gave you to think, because at the end of the day, like, we answer to Jesus. He's the ultimate authority, right? So there's discernment and wisdom that can be had while still submitting in those relationships with other people, and still laying down your pride for the good of your marriage and your family. So I could go on and on. Like, this opens up, I know, a whole can of worms and a ton of questions that you might have. So I could go on and on about the nuances and dynamics of submission within our relationships. But I want to talk about our submission to God before our time is over here. So let's look at James 4:7. It tells us to submit ourselves to God and to resist the devil, and he will flee from us. And then in Job 22:1, it says, submit to God and you will be at peace. Then things will go well for you. So in both of these verses, we don't just get told like, hey, submit to God, okay, because I said so. No. In these verses, we see the why behind it. So submit yourselves to God and resist the devil, and he will flee from you. James knows that there's a constant battle happening for our hearts and our minds and our souls, right? And we know that Satan is constantly and cunningly trying to get us to make small little steps and small little decisions that are going to slowly lead us and draw us away from Jesus. And so what Paul is saying is that if we will align and submit our lives under the authority of Jesus and what he tells us is a better way to live, then Satan has no choice but to run away, right? So Paul's not just saying submit to God, he's saying it because he knows the battle that's happening, and he knows that ultimately Jesus has victory over that if we will continue to choose to walk in the way he says is best. So it's for our protection. And then the verse in Job says, submit to God and you will be at peace, which, like, could anyone else use a little peace right now? Right? So we see a direct correlation with submitting to God and finding peace. And Jesus doesn't just ask us to follow these rules and live a certain way because he hates fun and he doesn't want us to enjoy life or is on a major power trip. It's actually like the exact opposite. And if you're a parent, you'll understand this. You have structure and rules and discipline in place to protect your children, to ensure a really bright and joyful future for them because you have really good plans for them. In the same way, Jesus calls us to live and act and be obedient according to what he knows. He wrote the manual, he wrote the book on how to live life. And so he knows what's best and true. And he asks us to live in that so that we can live in peace and have lives that glorify him and that lead to freedom. So the goal of submission is not oppression, it's freedom. It's freedom from constantly striving to get our own way, putting others down to get where we want to go, and having to figure all of this out on our own. And what I find so comforting and amazing is that Jesus never asks us to do anything that he hasn't already done or live in a way that he hasn't already lived. And Jesus models for us that there's great strength in submission. And in the Gospels, we find Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane as he is agonizing over what he knows will happen to him the very next day, when he's going to be beaten and spit on and mocked, nailed to a cross and brutally murdered. And in his very real humanity, he cries out to God saying, Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me. Like, don't have me do this. Yet, and that word changes everything for us, yet, not my will, but yours be done. Matthew's version says that Jesus fell with his face to the ground and prayed, my Father, if it is possible, may this cup please be taken from me. Yet, right? Not as I will, but as you will. And Jesus is so human in this moment. Like, of course he doesn't want to die this gruesome death the next day. Of course he's scared. Of course he's not excited and full of joy to go and experience like unimaginable pain. Of course, if he could accomplish saving humanity in any other way, he would take that option 10 times out of 10. Like door number 3, every time, like, I'll just take the other option. So he asked for that. Like, it's so real. It's so human. He says, Father, is there any other option? But he doesn't leave it there. Ultimately, he submits himself to the will of the Father because he knows and believes and has faith that his Father, who loves him more than anything, knows what's best. And that's the key. Trusting that what we are submitting to is for our own good, which is not always the case in our earthly relationships. I get it. Like, Jesus, we are in these relationships where we don't trust or believe or know that those people have our best interest in mind, right? They've showed us the opposite. But Jesus has allowed these people in positions of leadership and calls us to respect, pray for, and submit to that leadership. And hear me, like, side note, time out, hear me. Anytime the will or leadership of someone else is in direct opposition of what Jesus says is best and true, his will and his truth is the ultimate authority. Always. So I just disclaimer, I'm not saying you submit to no matter what your husband is asking you to do, and no matter how abusive or toxic it is, to submit to that. No, Jesus is the ultimate authority. And our husbands and our governments and our parents, they're all called to lead us to Jesus and to lead us in the way that he would lead us. But that doesn't always happen. And how we see Jesus in these Gospels the night before he's going to be crucified sums up submission so beautifully. It's giving up this attitude of entitlement to get your own way and laying that down for the sake of another and for accomplishment of God's will, which is a lot. It's a lot to chew on, and it's not easy. But as we end today, I just want us to think through a couple of things. So will you choose to trust that Jesus' plans for you are good? And if they are, then can you trust that what he's asking you to do or asking you not to do, or to submit to or be obedient to, is because he loves you so much and he has really good plans for you, and he knows that the way to get to those plans is to live this certain way. And then where is he asking you to submit today? What relationships do you need to lay down your pride and your selfish wants and your entitlement in order to lovingly serve those relationships instead? So that's all I have for you guys. I love you so much. I miss you. Can we please just see each other already? I can't wait. Yeah, we'll talk to you later. Love you guys.